Next time you could do a podcast. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Ryan Steck, the Artistic Director of Art Engine. I'm here with famous new media artist Jeremy Bailey, or perhaps there's less AR involved today, so I should just say Jeremy Bailey. Jeremy's practice is full of a blend of performance and technology. I consider him a leader in the Canadian context of what we once called new media. He also recently founded UAR, a commercial platform for augmented reality sculpture, and is the head of experience at FreshBooks, a human of many hats. Welcome to Art Engine, Jeremy. Nice to see you. How are you doing?
Great. Yeah, great to be here. Yeah, thanks for pointing out that we're both wearing hats.
It was not planned. It's perfect. I like yours.
And I'm a little less augmented, a little less famous today. But yeah, really happy to be here and excited to talk about this.
We've been doing a number of conversations around the wrap-up of this phase of the Digital Economies Lab, and you've been working with us to help shape the program. But of course, this incredible moment of the NFT hype has sort of broken into the mainstream, and we thought it was interesting to have a conversation and talk about some of the intersections with the work that we've been doing. But to sort of start and frame this conversation, could you help us put some of this current hype moment in context and talk a bit about what other kinds of experiments in monetization have been undertaken in the history of new media, and what kind of insights emerge from that?
Yeah, so I think the first, there are like several contexts to unpack. The first context, it's worth noting, is not like that recent. We are within at least a half decade or decade of artists experimenting with the blockchain and with crypto. And it was almost cliche just a few years ago for an artist to express themselves with like a token. Like, for this exhibition, I've made my own token. It's called Jer token, or famous new media artist token.
Yeah.
And there's some artists that actually did it well. So I don't want to trash on like an era of experimentation. What's different, I think, right now is we're seeing what's pretty normal in new media, which is like to try something really early on, go mainstream. I think if you look at it in a broader perspective of new media in general, there are several interesting insights historically. I would say that the first one is to go back to the kind of beginning of new media, which different people would place at different places, but I kind of put it in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when video art first emerged. And specifically, artists that were working with video early on were counteracting monetization. And there were a few reasons for that. The first was a lot of them were Fluxus artists, artists like Nam June Paik, Yoko Ono, who were coming out of a period where they had a manifesto declaring, that art had become over commodified. And so it was a movement to release art from commodification and make art experiential. Sounds kind of familiar actually to the internet era, right, where everything's an experience and experiences have been monetized. But it was actually the action was to make art free and accessible to everyone. And there were things like happenings and so on, which were like large get-togethers or parties almost, if you think about it, where people would basically sense together or have experiences that couldn't be recreated in documentation. Artists like Chris Burden even talked about it. Like, you can't commodify this performance. It exists for this period of time, then never again. Then video comes along, and I think a lot of artists started to experiment with that, and also counter-reacting to a history of commercial media, right? Like, 50 years of television had been about commerce, Leave It to Beaver, the Brady Bunch, whatever, and pleasing the advertiser. And you had artists like Richard Serra at that time making videos like Television Delivers People, where they were really describing the audience as a commodity being delivered by television to advertisers. And so that history is very interesting. And, artists even made their own tools, but they were not at all interested in selling, right? They're interested, just kind of basically in making the media available. And that and so begins kind of the era of personal media, which is a lot of what we consider the history of new media. So as we progress, through the 1980s and 90s, and new media becomes associated with newer technologies, specifically computer and digital technologies that were emerging at the time. But don't forget, like for a long time, it was just like video synthesizers and analog stuff, right? But there's this kind of moment, obviously in the 90s, where things get a lot faster, and there's the flip to the internet as well. And then I think the history that we're talking about today, really begins because the internet is, a next wave technology. And artists that we would now call net artists start to experiment in that realm. What I think is interesting is, again, these artists they weren't actually trying to produce a counter narrative. They were producing a net new narrative, and corporations were catching up to them, right? So yeah. You had AOL and companies almost advertising like, this is the place where you will get to express yourself like an artist. And people were looking for the niches or edges of human experience, the same way they might have done in person in the 1960s, but now in this global village of the internet.
Do you see it, as a repurposing of commercial technology? Like I associate the history of media art as one that is almost a parasitic nature of artists sort of taking, right from the most iconic piece of the Portapak is the production of an object and a tool from a massive global corporation that artists then try to figure out how to not necessarily produce a counter narrative, as you were saying, like that, but try to somehow write a new story within that, and that this kind of continues to evolve. Do you think that the era of net art and the one that we're in now is these tools, are they at a granular level more, it isn't just this sort of binary relationship, there really is building tools and something that isn't just about, repurposing a commercial industrial thing? Yeah,
no, I think that's super interesting. Like, so the Portapak obviously was Sony's first consumer video camera, and at that time, the most the best-selling consumer electronics device in history. But it was marketed to everyone. Like, you can look at ads from that era, and it's like businessman and tree shooting video of baby birds. But prior to that time, people had to shoot on 8mm film, get it processed. It was a whole hassle. Yeah. So it was a revolution, like in a mass media commercial context, and they made money from it. And then the artists, you're right, like did reappropriate that technology. And I think of what happened right after that, which is artists like Nam June Paik, working with others, started to design their own video tools, like video synthesizers. And then that was true. That's been true in new media forever. A lot of new media artists have open source tools, or especially in the creative coding community, you have long, time legacy stuff like Casey Rice and working on processing, which, then others have worked on in regards to P5JS, but, or Open Frameworks, which was a creative coding platform that allowed a lot of the, kind of experiments that I did early on to happen. I think that's also true, though, of this era with the cryptocurrency stuff that I mentioned earlier, or blockchain experiments where artists actually, artists, like I remember my friend Billy Rennenkamp, like years ago, was like, Jeremy, like, this is how the blockchain is going to like change everything. And here's what it means philosophically. Like they positioned it ideologically. And that ideology has definitely been soaked up by like a larger community, but artists were at the forefront early on.
Yeah, I wonder if we could talk a bit about this moment of disruption in the current cliche use of the word disruption. Like it feels to me very similar to other sort of Silicon Valley disruptions, that there's really, at this moment, instead of there being some profound reforming of the way we organize things, it's really a kind of concentrated concentrated bit of power that is creaked open, but really it's really moved from one small group to another, and
Sure.
that the hype here is really, yes, it maybe puts a tiny crack in some of the sort of dealer art, traditional like high-end art, high finance world, but it doesn't really transform power structures or transform even the general space of artists' lives.
Yeah, like you're making the argument like Tesla is no better than GM or whatever in terms of like, I mean, at the end of the day, they're just transplanting consumer to a new bucket, and the powerful stay in power, or it's just just change the faces on the About Us page, basically.
Yes, it feels like that. Does it feel like that to you sometimes? I mean, I don't feel like that necessarily all the time about every single thing, but it's a kind of creeping feeling that sometimes gets in the way of trying to get to some of the more interesting things that might be happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worthwhile noting that, even if we were to go back to the 1960s, attention economy dictated that I named a few names, like I rattled off a couple names at the outset, and that those names actually stayed in power for the next 50 or 60 years. So the art world has been very good historically at canonizing, but the tool for canon has primarily been the written word, which I've always found particularly interesting. Like that's how art has established its value historically. And there have been a few gatekeepers, and back early on, it would have been like your Clement Greenberg or something like that. People would argue that the internet actually like allowed, a vast democratization of who people paid attention to as legitimate artists, right?
Yeah. Well, the transportation of media as well, changed the experience of it, because not only the primary sort of canonization, but really to this day, the primary experience of many artworks is through the written word. Like we read about artworks far more than we ever get access to them.
Yeah, and I mentioned the kind of the attention economy because even within the platforms, algorithms are programming themselves to like put the thing in front of you that they think you're going to most like, but the algorithm needs variables, and one of the variables will be, well, what's something someone like you also liked, right? Or who are some credible sources we could anchor to that would kind of legitimize that this is worth your time. But if you take the polar opposite position where everything is available at all time, you're kind of in this fifth element moment where images are just like flickering in front of you. There's no way you could possibly quote unquote consume the breadth of media. And so I don't know if we've, there's a psychological wall that we don't often talk about in this space, which is like the number of names and the themes of a movement that, like there might be in any given art movement, like people presenting, 100 different views on or takes, right? And then we choose one and we say, that's what that was all about, right? YBAs, it was, it was all about money and sex or something like that. We just like that's it, right?
Yeah, once we
more nuance.
Summarize it into that point, and that I think in terms of like, one of the another sort of, let's say, critical or sort of cynical feeling that rises up around this moment and the expansion into the popular imagination of the cryptocurrencies and the way NFT has kind of as a concept has really like brought that forward, is it feels like this kind of granular monetization and privatization of the net. Like that everything becomes a kind of possible to ascribe ownership to. I wonder how you have been thinking about the idea of public value in this moment, because your practice has really, you've been involved in all kinds of scales of work, lots of public institutions, and very much about community in your practice as well in the last few years. How do you think about public value in this moment?
Well, I think like you like if we like almost like blur the line between both questions, we wouldn't feel uncomfortable if a lot of people who didn't normally make a lot of money were suddenly making a lot of money. If the pyramid got turned upside down, if it was like women of color were making millions of dollars in NFTs, you'd be pretty excited, I think, right? You'd be championing this as like a major win.
Yeah.
I think, one of the reasons it's uncomfortable is that that we're not necessarily seeing that. There are exceptions for sure, though. And there are some communities, I think, like the Hen community, which is an NFT community that's zero carbon and open source, where people are coming together around the original internet ideals, the ideals of like sharing, cooperation, like helping each other. And it's less fiduciary in like, or less about the finance of that exercise, right? Like, I think that's one of the perverted things, right? As soon as capital touches an artwork, we start to change the value system by which we evaluate that work, right? Now we're evaluating it based on how much it's sold for instead of its value of, content, if you will, to use like a term that actually has been commodified, right? But like content by any other word would be like something that pushes culture forward, right? Or that if we go back to the 1970s, appropriates the language of television to forward the culture such that women, are no longer relegated to cooking show hosts or something like that, right?
Is it possible for us to do you think it's possible to have some of these kind of interesting gains without these kind of massive hype cycles? Like I think of something like, what Pokemon Go did for AR and the way that changed not just the popular imagination, but a willingness to try something in this domain. But of course, there's all kinds of, commercial noise that comes with that in the sort of tail end of it.
Yeah.
But is it possible to have that without this kind of massive commercial hype?
It's almost obvious that like there's a first mover advantage in terms of the attention economy. Like if I'm there first and there's nothing else to look at, you get a certain amount of value just from being there first. And that's been true for generations of media, right? Including the first like apps on the App Store for your iPhone or something, right? Like you would download, I don't know what crappy apps you had on your that first period, but how often do you even visit the App Store now? You were just curious to figure out what's this all about. And that behavior, among early adopters is actually counterintuitive to like, like larger audience behavior. There's this concept, Jeffrey Moore, an economist, introduced that was like this idea of, early adopters and this point every startup gets to where they have to cross a chasm. Getting into the mainstream is actually extremely difficult because the values that the early adopter has, novelty, being there first, like similar to like uncovering a band, all those things don't actually translate to like the broader, mainstream audience, what's called the majority in Jeffrey Moore's model. And then there's a group after that called laggards, and they're definitely like, they will never convert, right? But the majority requires the early adopters to say, this is interesting, and maybe you should try it out. And there's an early majority that gets involved. And then after that point, though, the early adopters are no longer interested. They've moved on to the next kind of thing, right? And yeah, there's Gartner's hype cycle that also explains, you get this peak of hype driven by, the hysteria of those early adopters, and then there's the trough of disillusionment, it's called in Gartner's hype cycle. And then there's this like steady incline toward hope and some sort of like practical application that is actually beneficial to society. But I think that it's natural because we're just trying to figure out the media. Again, like Marshall McLuhan might have said, we're looking in the rearview mirror to try and figure out or project what this media is really going to mean. And so we're building a new vocabulary.
Do you think some of that in relation to ownership, is that like, is that part of the long tail and part of the problem that is like a bit of because is the sort of conundrum that is being continued to work on. It's not like a lot of the hype press was like, there's never been a way to ascribe ownership to a digital file before, as if the entire legal profession didn't exist. But nonetheless, there are interesting aspects of the way to think about and evolutions of that. Is that the wrong focus though? Is that like, does that sort of just reproduce that review mirror effect that you were just talking about? That we're basically trying to, in the end, recreate intellectual property that existed prior to.
Or figure out how to create property within the digital realm when it was never designed for that. And I think like when you're asking for context, there are lots of examples including, Raphael Rosendahl, a collaborator of mine who created website contracts, but people who were trying to monetize or create some kind of digital form of an artist certificate that would apparently have value. And the reason for that was just that there were a lot of digital artists, a lot of net artists who were poor, who were not like were told, who couldn't, dealers would say, I can't sell your work. Like if it doesn't plug in, you're not going to be able to, it's not, sorry, if it plugs in, it doesn't sell, right? That would be the kind of the normal thing. And, this didn't really kind of, over time, this argument didn't really make sense when people saw the internet economy become the primary economy, like that there's like, it was almost like a tension built up, I feel like over the last 20 years, because I know I felt it too, and tried to introduce this topic numerous times in different art circles where I'd say like, hey, how come like artists are not benefiting from this, massive macroeconomic trend? How come it seems like artists are getting left behind? And in fact, artists were mostly contributing their value for free. I think what was different is instead of for free to each other, like, as a communal or cooperative activity, often do platforms that were then, as Richard Serra would have said, were delivering those artists as product to advertisers. And then you get to the era of like the content producer. And I think that it's worth being resentful about that, because we have like 20 years of labor that was essentially funneled into those companies, YouTube, which is Google, Facebook, and Instagram, which is Instagram, and all of those companies, Snap.
I've thought a lot about it in terms of YouTube. When you look at that history of YouTube, and there's the user-created content, but even their relationship to piracy, that was so, like, imagine if they had to actually follow real, true copyright laws, how difficult it would have been, and still to this day.
It would have been possible. Yeah. But it is a massive graveyard of, artist labor. That's what I would refer to it as. And and at some point, there hopefully is some kind of, I don't know. I mean, it also trained audiences to believe that this is something that they should expect for free. And the present day, very few artists contribute to those economies or have started to stop or look for alternatives. And what you're seeing is those that are there are like dying of stress, right? Because the algorithms require continuous uploads, daily uploads, and it's not sustainable. So there's a new generation of startups. There's this thing called the creative economy that Kickstarter was the first to identify, that are trying to figure out, hey, can we establish models that help finance art, create, they're just using the term creators these days, right? The creative economy. But I think artists fit in there, and artists, certainly I haven't seen very many galleries jump in front of that and say like, hey, actually, we'd like to get involved in helping artists live sustainable lives. And so
we're happy to present the work, but how it gets paid,
But for any investment, there's got to be a return, right? So I think that that's also a reason to be, suspicious, and another reason why artists should be, again, like, building their own tools. And I think getting out in front of it, understanding the technologies, and potentially cooperating to create alternatives, which they are doing. And that's why I'm encouraged. I think there's two narratives going on right now. One is of cooperation, and the other is, yes, of further capitalization, for sure.
Well, I think that there is something to be said for the sort of long tail of the NFT moment in the popular imagination of like, really, ownership was possible before, but it has really driven home the idea that that there are creators who make things, and that maybe they should be paid, and that this sort of even the sort of hyperbolic way that some of the popular press might report on it, of like the trying to use outrageous language that someone's paying for a cat gif or something like that, as if that's the same art. A blue painting, I can't imagine playing et cetera, going back, a century. But there is this idea that these are things that are made by creators of one kind or another, and that the next phase of figuring out, like, okay, everything shouldn't be free necessarily, or if things should be free for access, how do they get made? Like.
writers were the first to experience this.
Mm,
The internet made writing free first because it was the cheapest media to distribute.
yeah.
And and most writers today that are not writing for a corporation are building out their own subscriber bases, right? They're doing the Substack thing, they're building a newsletter, right? Or they've become like embedded in companies as like copywriters or whatever, right? But certainly like every media and every creator is going through that same narrative in their head, like, if I continue to give this away for free, when does it actually pay off, right?
Yeah.
And to your point earlier, it does pay off, but for a very slim group of people who kind of transcend that fame
Yeah.
barrier. And then from my experience talking to friends and being in similar contexts at different times, what it allows you to do is like not do your art, like do some like commercial deal, or like get this interesting project, or get like ultimately a commission, right? Like that's what we're all seeking. It's
Yeah.
like to get that big commission, which is back to the patronage model of like pre-Victorian era kind of art making.
But do you think, like in this moment, we're seeing a few more things that feel a little less like winner take all kind of structures, which is so,
Yeah.
America's done such a great job of exporting that kind of approach. Do you feel like we're seeing more of that?
Yeah, we are. So like, first of all, of the NFT platforms, you've probably heard of some of the big ones, right? Your foundations, your Nifty gateways, one's owned by the Winklevoss twins, famously of Facebook. So it seems like, uh-oh, don't touch that. But meanwhile, there are several that have been started by artists. There's Feral File, started by Casey Reese, who I mentioned. There's Folia, or maybe it's the reverse that he started Folia, I can't remember. Then there's like the Hick and Nunk one, the Hen for short, that I mentioned, and that's open source. And they're building like a gallery model inside of that where you can build galleries, and there are even like exhibitions that have happened that specifically highlight underrepresented artists. It's actually kind of encouraging. It reminds me of like in your local city, like the neighborhood context. And I know geography does play into this, I think. You might remember an era, and even in media, of the film festival or something where a small community came together to support one another. In my own experience in, for example, the Hen community was like, hey, get on this platform, and like, hey, let us help you figure out how to use it. And then like, you can use my template, and people were trading with me in a way that, was really quite refreshing. On the flip side, obviously, there are these huge like auctions that Christie's has got involved with and Sotheby's. That always is going to exist, though. They're always going to try and capitalize on hype, right?
If we can talk a bit more about the geography aspect, because I think, that there's this like a long sort of subtext and sometimes overt about a bound or a borderless world, that's bound up in internet culture and digital culture as well. That there's like this rhetoric of sort of global globalness. But local contexts are so specific and important. How do you understand for you that those relationships between local communities, like city geographies, but maybe also local artistic communities and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I've been a part of the internet art community, and there are many communities actually within that for a long time. And there is this sort of digital nomad thing that goes with it. And honestly, like that wasn't my decision. Like I remember feeling like my local community rejected what I was doing because they didn't understand it. There's some exceptions to that rule, like Berlin, quote unquote, like certain cities like stepped in and said like, we are the internet or something for internet artists. Just to be candid about it. But on the flip side, I've been working with a bunch of Toronto-based artists for my UAR, thing, which you said I founded this big thing. It's just a Shopify store, right? That I like made function for sculpture in augmented reality. But I was like, oh, let me make it local. Let me try doing a local show. And then, and it'll feel like, because that'll like transcend this. It does feel like people don't connect to what's going on the internet, and it doesn't really have that local connection, because I think local connections still matter. And I've experienced that in Toronto, right? Where like my work, unless it had some kind of local context, just was like meaningless. It was like out in the internet ether.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm in the process of like planning and trying to figure out what that means personally. So I think it's a topic of interest. I did try and approach a local gallery to show, that shows new media, to show these works, and they they decided they didn't want to. Um, which I was like curious, because I was like, it's completely digital, so you actually don't have to show anything, right? You just have
Yeah.
to say you're showing it, like
Yeah.
just say it. just, but there seems to be this. One of the tensions I've encountered in my career as an internet artist is a tension between like the walls of the gallery, like thou shalt not pass, and the kind of more fluid boundaries of the internet. And for me, it's really important to recognize that the internet is a social or relational aesthetic. It's not, like what is it? Web 2.0 introduced that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not that dissimilar from the way geographic networks function too. And I think they just haven't mixed well for whatever reason.
To me, as we've seen internet culture grow, or more, it's not, that's even a kind of a poor term. As we've seen the space of digital technologies in our everyday lives, there has been such a multiplicity of cultures. There is no more an internet culture or digital culture. It is so entangled in the everyday life. And so then that means there's all these transportable places and new spaces where artists should be involved. Like it should be able to be, and not borderless in the sense of the way we used to think about that and that globalization, but the way that there can be.
I think you're right.
Such a blurry boundary.
It's often difficult to contain, and that's why I think of it very similar to the Fluxus, right? Where it's like the art happens kind of here instead of here on the wall, right? It's happening kind of in the head. And I've made a lot of artworks that were, designed to be distributed that way. And when I was creating works for YouTube, I always imagined them as a component of the algorithm or part of the stream, because that was the context, right? But that is very difficult to grasp in a physical sense.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting. You're sort of being reductive about your AR project, saying it's just a Shopify store, but that touches on the idea of this kind of ubiquitous nature of these technologies and how the tools can be picked up and the sort of back-end elements or cobbled together for pieces to do what are quite unique and interesting ideas without having to build this whole thing up. And maybe is that, do you think, one of the, maybe wider lessons of the moment to try to get local communities to sort of, if they see the NFT hype and try to understand it, to think that if that opens up into a world of a plethora of digital technologies that can allow you to make something that's interesting and valuable for your community.
Yeah, I think that's the Porta-Pack moment, right? Like you pick up the camera, like in the 1969, you pick, you're Namju Pike, you go to the Macy's department store, you pick up a video camera, you get in a cab, you get stuck in traffic because the Pope's there. You record the Pope going by and you show it in a gallery in Soho later that night. You call it video art, right? But if you didn't go to Macy's and pick it up or try or record the Pope, or if you didn't have that experience, you didn't really participate in a cultural movement, I think. I think the fear I have is that by having an allergy to anything new, we reject the possibility of progress. And, to a certain extent, we say, I was talking to someone who works in the quote unquote arts, like opera, ballet, and they're like kind of a thinker in that space. And they're saying that whole realm of making now considers itself an elite group of people who exist solely to protect something that would otherwise not exist. So they exist at a point in time 300 years ago, and their job is as stewards of this like rare vase or artifact, right? And they're almost like a time capsule. But that is also, they also have the position that the audience can't possibly understand the value of that artifact. And so their audience numbers have been falling over time. But they actually consider themselves in direct conflict with their audience, which I find really interesting as an internet artist, where you almost have the opposite problem, where it's like, I want more audience, more, right? Like I need more likes. If you had that attitude on the internet, right? Like I don't know how you would value the work differently, but maybe there's something in the middle between like we reject the concept of an audience and we are just a vessel of history, and we must descend into the realm of like tchotchkes and like
Well,
whatever.
I wonder if we maybe divert a little bit to that like sort of Canadian scene discussion, because I know that you were part of putting the Digital Strategy Fund, gave some advice and counsel about that whole process. And now obviously we've had quite a bump in the road over the last year and a half, but as you've sort of seen some of these projects unfold and met people both probably formally and informally, been on tons of panels, I'm sure, how are you seeing that sort of digital adaptation happen across the country in the different contexts?
Well, it's interesting. The person I mentioned, though I didn't give them their name, I should. It's David Maggs, but he wrote a paper on the topic, and he received two grants from that fund. And he basically he has a really interesting point of view. Maybe I shouldn't just steal someone else's point of view, but there are several crises that we're experiencing currently. Like climate change is one. Racial injustice is another. The pandemic is a third, right? And then the digitization is potentially kind of another one, and the expropriation of capital. But anyway, he was saying like all of these you can look at them separately, and the art world can be like up in arms about the crisis we're facing, like, oh my God, like this is wrong and that's wrong. Or you could consider them all actually symptoms of the same problem, which is that we're upholding an unjust system. Oh, sorry, I didn't even mention like reconciliation, right? The indigenous rights crisis. So all of these things are actually conflated, and the arts are ignoring their responsibility to actually advance on these major events, instead what we're seeing quite often is like, well, I can't participate. Like it's on the internet. I can't possibly participate. And actually the internet might be one of the answers to the problem if we were to embrace it as like a technology that might allow us to investigate what are, like issues that require participation. Like none of these issues can be solved in a corner.
Yeah.
They require actually activism and participation to fully reconcile.
Yeah,
I think that's a really interesting perspective. Sorry.
Yeah, no, particularly I find it's very resonant with some of the discussions we've been having here, particularly with something like climate change. I think is a great example of the climate crisis. It's clear that more scientific facts, will not transform action, right? If there is one thing we've learned from I was an environmental activist in the 90s, and the story has not changed. And so, here at ArtEdge, we've been reflecting about that, like, well then, there's a crisis. What is the artist's role in responding to the crisis? And clearly, there is a major gaps in what work needs to be done through all kinds of sectors. And the knowledge is known about the crisis. Participating in rethinking and restructuring and imagining a different way.
But that's the thing. I think that's the key word. Like if I was gonna like hashtag this thing, it would be hashtag participate, but like if you don't participate, you don't actually get to be a part of the happening. And the happening is where we arrive at the new experience that we've never had before.
Yeah.
I think a rejection of it is dangerous because you leave it in the hands of the few that might not necessarily be in the right place to make a good decision socially, because it is so macro in scale. Like it's not like we're gonna fall back on something else. Like it's not like the arts and crafts movement's just ahead of us and we're gonna start whittling wood. It's just not gonna happen that way, you know?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, that's like, how do we participate and how do you think about participation in a very complex technological world, right? Where participation in the early 20th century, in the early 20th century, it was already too complex, right? Like for you to participate in politics in a way that was conceived when, community and localness was perhaps the extent of your affect in the world. And now it's so huge. So I think really artists need to be part of the laboratory of thinking about how do we participate in discussions that have ramifications, global ramifications, in all of those wicked problems that you've been talking about. As we sort of maybe touch back on the question of this technological moment and the kind of the sort of blockchain contractual sort of obsession that's happening right now. What do you think can emerge from there for people? What do you think is the most interesting thing to sort of come out of this moment, or where should we try and foster like more interesting activity there?
It's really happening fast, and in ways that I can't ignore are somewhat exciting. And even if it reproduces a certain amount of power, there are a certain displacement of power that's very exciting to me. And as an example, a friend of mine recently went to work at a company, not his name, the company is called Rally, and they exist to help creators create their own coins and their own, like, basically their own economies around their practice, where people who participate in their practice can increase the value of their participation. It's kind of bizarre, but the actual organization is based in Silicon Valley, but is decentralized, and the creators actually vote on the progress of the company and all of the decisions that get made, right? So, by any other kind of, like, I would never have imagined that 10 years ago that there would be companies that start up and they're like, our model is going to be cooperation from day one, like, right. And we're going to let the customers like vote on our most important issues, kind of thing. People still get paid, don't get me wrong, and they're also taking a cut, but the fact that it's a decentralized, distributed model of decision making from day one as a company is really interesting to me. Similarly, there are artist cooperatives, like I've mentioned a few, and artists run startups where the artists are generating better splits, like 90-10 or 85-15 for the artists. And not only that, building in royalties for the secondary market, which we know is where most of the excess value is created, right? So I've been working with a group in Berlin to launch a platform. We're working towards a prototype in the fall, and we brought a summer school of individuals together. And it's really amazing to see who's joined this summer school, by the way. It's like people from startups, artists, all kinds of people. But one of the things that we hit early on in terms of like, well, what technologies should we use, was like the idea of, well, of value exchange in the secondary, tertiary, and like whatever. How does value propagate over time? And I think the blockchain, like, we keep coming back to it. We can't think of another technology that's better at automating the practice of being accountable to the original creator. And of course, there are legal precedents for this, right? But I don't know if you've ever had to chase down your copyright, because I've had stuff as an artist. It is really expensive and really inaccessible to an artist. So if we could even automate the legal layer of protecting your creative copyright in some manner, I think that represents tremendous value. Now, I know there's a lot of fault in the current implementation of a lot of these platforms that they don't actually protect your copyright at all, because someone could just steal the thing and you're still not legally protected. But I see this as like stairs, in a staircase toward an ideology, and the ideology is right, which is like attribution to the artist, over time matters.
Yeah, I think that the key moment in there, and I really liked hearing what you were saying about decentralization there, because I have this skepticism where oftentimes within that techno infrastructure, decentralization is kind of what they really mean is an anti-state, anti-regulation idea, like how to get the state and go around sort of regulation or take regulation out of a kind of governmental structure.
And we assume that's shady, right? But what's interesting is there was that the case of the fuel pipeline getting hacked, right? The ransomware attack, right? And they were paid in Bitcoin, but all of that Bitcoin's since been recovered by the government, right? And the interesting thing when you read about it was the government was like, yeah, it's a public ledger. We could see all the transactions
Yeah.
between the hackers and, where they were moving the money.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we have to be careful for is like the assumption that the existing system was built to be fair.
Yeah.
Specifically when the banking sector excluded, vast majority of the American Black population, as an example, in terms of getting a mortgage, right? Full geographies were held off limits. And that was built into the system, right, and supported. And then we backed that system up after 2008 during the Wall Street crash, right? And we allowed a whole generation of people to default on student loans and to go bankrupt on medical debt. But we ran to rescue this system that we think is so great. So in terms of like, yeah, sure, like maybe I'm going long on this kind of thing, but like, it's easy to be like, oh, look, like all the like Wall Street bros are building this new thing. It's just that there are artists there too. And I think, if you're not aware of that, you should be, that there are artists actually behind the scenes.
Yeah.
I think that's really special.
Yeah, and I think it's maybe it's my age as well. It's getting older, and the anxiety of these moments of change. That on one hand, I can see the potential for change, and I see where those things are happening. But so many times, moments of revolution are moments of opportunity for the ultra powerful and ultra capitalist, right? How do we try to like amplify the most interesting parts of it?
We have to participate. Like you have to be a co-owner of this like future. But otherwise I think you're right. There's going to be a bunch of millionaires that maybe some of them it's a lot to rely on. Like, let's just trust they do the right thing, right? I mean, the nice thing is a bunch of these systems are built on cooperation from the outset, knowing that that's like a tendency. And then some of them aren't. So we'll see what shakes out. I'm really on the side of like the cooperativist future, and the idea that the technology is commodified to the extent that you can pull it off the shelf like nuts and bolts. And that's what I'm doing, and that's what others are doing now. We're not actually like inventing it. We're just like, oh yeah, I'll take one of those, I'll take one of those, like piece it together.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. Maybe before we go, is there something you're working on right now that you're sort of headed to? Is UAR is that like a kind of a baby that you're really working on, like trying to pull it into its next phase?
Well, it was created as an artwork for exhibition, which anyone could, that's why I kind of downplayed it, because that's what it was created for. But then what I'm doing now is I'm working with other artists. I mentioned a bunch of Toronto-based ones, but what I'm trying to do is transform it from like, it's the Jeremy Bailey show, to supporting other artists. And I'm actually helping them build artworks and figure out how to sell them. And so expect we'll do some kind of a little launch later this summer, and I'll flip the site into being all about them instead of about me. And then next fall, I'm working towards this more open augmented reality platform where anyone will be able to sell augmented reality artworks online. Augmented reality will always be just like a bizarrely hilarious media for me, because it's like always going to be out of reach. I guarantee you this. We'll be like 75 years old talking about this. It's going to be like future state that never arrives. But going to have some fun with that, I think, this fall. So stay tuned to that. And generally, my whole thing right now is to try and train other artists on these tools and this stuff. So that's the privilege of, I think, talking with you today, is like, if we could just get more, it's the access problem. It's like cable access, but now we have artist finance access. Like, I want to teach people how to do their taxes.
Well, that's great. Jeremy Bailey, tax tutor, on the way.
Yeah, I should have disclosed I work at an accounting software company.
All right.
Thanks, Ryan.
Well, thanks again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.